This has been a wonderful day of listening to well-paced papers, well-timed papers, having had time to think about them and to respond to them. But having said that, the real bravery and intellectual courage now lies to my left because we have three graduate students who I will introduce only by mentioning the places where they are studying. Kirsten Lee here is one of ours at Penn. David LeBlanc is from Penn State, and Katie Thorpe is visiting us from Princeton. And we gave them the charge of listening to the talks and not responding in any kind of complete manner, but responding to the ideas that they thought most compelling or most disturbing or most something or the other. So that's all I have to say at this point. I'm looking forward to listening to them and to their provocations, and also recognizing that the 45 minutes we have now are an opportunity for us to revisit the issues that have circulated through the day so that we can continue some of our conversations, but we'll take our lead from them. So we are going to be beginning with David.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know how disturbed I am, but I'll give it a shot. So thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Suvir, to allow us to participate in the conference this way. It's a really great opportunity. So yeah, wonderful papers all day. Of course, I'm very biased to the first panel because I'm responding to them. I'm biased in their favor, I should say. But yeah, great papers. It's been a great day. I've learned a lot. So in trying to find a way to join the two papers of the first panel, I kind of came across the idea that's been coming up a lot in the conversations today, and that is Swift's apparent ambivalence to that which he mocks, the stance that he takes. So in Dr. McDowell's looking at the history of ears, as he pointed out, he mocks both print and oral culture, and yet he also participates in them, of course. So he is writing a tale that uses print features, uses punctuations, the format of the page, et cetera, to approximate the actions of speech. So even though he mocks it, he participates in it. Also in the idea, Dr. Elf, I presume, is the idea of like projects. Yes, he mocks projects, but we also have, we know that he also wrote his own projects and he tried to publish them, and so he participated in the project culture that way. He also just draws attention to projects by satirizing them, so drawing attention to them. So trying to bring that all together and also trying to, in a very superficial way, try to connect it to some of the topics of this conference, the idea of the words both wit and travel. So if I'm going to set up kind of a goofy metaphor here, Swift, in a way, is traveling between the poles of outright mockery and participation, and he's doing that through wit, and wit manifesting in actual satire. So that's my silly metaphor for it. So that's a very generalized approach, but when actually looking at these papers, I want to ask the question, if he's flying between these two poles, where does he land when it comes to both these works? So in this, in The Tale of the Tub, in this history of ears, you mentioned towards the beginning, you asked this question, why would anyone want to write a general history of ears? So I kind of want to return to that question and poke it a little bit, see if it wobbles. So the satire, if we were going to use a kind of voodoo, which was brought up in another presentation, it's prompting laughter, but it's at a revolution that's already underway. It's the print revolution. So he's trying to kind of poke it a little bit and get a laugh out of it. But he also understands that it is there and he's going to participate in it. So it's possibly corrective. I know a proposal for correcting, improving, and ascertaining the English tongue, which I think there's an edition of on display here, seems to be something he was concerned with. But beyond that, where does Swift land in this kind of conversation between print, oral culture, the changes that he's looking at? And I think we need to investigate really the particularities of how he really tries to intervene between oral and print cultures in The Tale of the Tub. So how does this participation materialize in the actual work? And so how is a Tale of the Tub, an object containing language, work a satirical argument against language? It's a very strange position he places himself in. So I think one way about that is to look at how he actually uses language in a very particular way. So you mentioned asterisk at one point, how he looks at that, but all other forms of punctuation, the form of the page, like I mentioned before, how that approximates like speech action in a way. It's also, I think A Tale of the Tub is particularly interesting because it's a rhetorical delivery, but it seems to also challenge rhetorical consumption. With its digressions, it challenges the reader and it challenges readerly expectations when a reader arrives at it. Also, things like the mockery of the church, there's these kind of, in that time, there were these things that maybe pushed readers away as much as he was trying to invite readers into the discourse. So that's kind of my foray into that side of things. Now, as far as the projects go, and the Legato episode, I guess, of Gulliver's Travel, where does he land with that? So I really want to kind of problematize or challenge this word project and try to investigate what it really means, because he seems to be mocking certain types of projects in particular, or certain aspects of projects. So you have in the Legato episode, the ruler descends from the floating island, and enacts this academy of projection, and then leaves without any consideration of its function, its implementation, or even of its consequences. So he seems to be really mocking projects that don't really consider individual. So they're projects that are prompted by individuals, but they're not exactly performed by individuals. They're almost like these machines or mechanisms that are existing above individuals and exerting control over them. So kind of backing these projects and the prompting of these projects. So I think that's a very particular way that he's going about satirizing projecting and projects. Also, we think of the Cucumber Man, that great passage that you showed, the sooty hands, the cinder, the matching clothing. I mean, it's kind of the stirrings of the Industrial Revolution, like a figure of that. So kind of these like great mechanisms that are moving things at the same time that these individuals are trying to create projects having to do with them. And not just the rhetoric of projects, but also particular projects that use sophistry to usually to obscure underlying or ulterior motives, which was brought up in the discussion. So the Cucumber Man trying to get money out of Gulliver. So there's these ulterior motives that are obscured by this heightened rhetoric that's trying to create a project and present it to the reader. So I think it would be helpful to kind of expand our definition of project, or at least investigate it a little bit, and try to decide, what do we mean by that? What do we mean as a verb, to project, also as a noun, a project? So I don't really have a good ending to these comments, but that's kind of where I was tending, was trying to find somewhere in the ambivalence or the ambiguity of what satire is doing, how it's both a participation and a mockery of his subjects. So thank you.
So what we're going to do is listen to all three of them and then open it up. And I've been keeping track, and I'll remind people if the people they've addressed actually forget to respond, I'll make sure that you do. Okay. So, Kirsten.
Okay. I'll echo David's thanks, though I think my comments will sound very different in their account of Swift, perhaps as effect of my panel that I'm responding to, which is Re-mediating Swift. One thing that seems to be recurring for me in thinking back over this afternoon's panel is the idea of Swift's totalizing, or the totalizing qualities or potential of his satirical projects. I think in Rowson's adaptation, there's a sense that satire, his satirical representation turns on the idea that everything always has been or will always be bad on some level. And this gets picked up perhaps in our understanding of trolling, insofar as trolling relies on a circle of self-reference, known perhaps commonly in forms of social media, but not necessarily so. So my comments really are trying to think about how to take this totalizing aspect and think about its effect on the time of satire, the age of satire, and the objects of satire. Insofar as the objects of satire, I'm interested in the way that in Rowson's adaptation, it's not just the humanoid or humanistic societies that receive the sharpest critique. It's also the homonyms, or I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name.
Houyhnhnms.
Houyhnhnms?
Houyhnhnms?
Okay, not the homonyms, the Houyhnhnms, apologies. Which to me seems perhaps, it seems notable insofar as it extends the critique beyond human subjects, but it's not clear to me what the purpose of that critique could be without something like an anthropomorphism or anthropomorphic interest. And so this brings me to a sense that even within adaptations of Swift, Rowson's in particular, though I'd like to speculate about others, there's a sense that there has to be some sort of blind spot or extrapolation. And I'm curious about how to understand these blind spots in Rowson's adaptation, and perhaps also within the project of trolling, if we might call it that. How to understand these blind spots without recuperating them based on the totalness of our expectation, either of the awfulness depicted or of the awfulness critiqued. Separately from the case of this sort of total aspect within the satire, I'm interested in how this ramifies in our understandings of audience, and perhaps to extrapolate from that, what sort of hermeneutics attends the satire that we're seeing adapted out of Swift. If, as we heard about Rowson, so much of Swift and Swiftian adaptation depends on the careful scrutiny of the reader and its walking into a trap. And in addition, if in trolling, or rather in the sort of premise of trolling, there is an insider to the address and also an audience that is necessarily vexed, I'm wondering how then we as readers of Swift and his adaptations understand our role, and also what keeps us reading, if we know that we can expect our vexing, if we can expect our being made into the joke, or the sort of axis of the joke. And then in closing, I want to ask us to think about the role of time and the aging of Swift. It seems appropriate to point towards this in a panel that addresses adaptations, but specifically, I'd like to think about whether satire expires. This seems important in trying to let me reframe. I think this is important if we're to find things other than the contemporary and adaptations of Swift. The contemporary is in our own moment. If we're to hear both registers of that term, both the historical and the presentist, I think it's worth asking whether the joke of satire depends on its anti-future, which is to say its pessimism, its expectation of cruelty, its faith that everything will on some level always be bad. And so I guess I'm wondering, as in closing my remarks, if there's a sense that we can generate in reading Swift or in reading adaptations of Swift that has a more utopian or futurist element to its critique, an element that perhaps isn't anticipated by its own pessimism. And that's where I'll end.
Katie?
Great. Well, I just want to echo thanks to the organizers and to Suvir for inviting us here. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you for such wonderful papers. Yes, of course. Thanks. So this is a little bit ad lib, just as a kind of footnote. Okay, so one of the things that struck me about this last panel was the word norm that came up in both of the papers, but in really different ways. So in Professor Yousaf's paper, he described how satire satire speaks against the normalizing outrageous abuses of the law. And so how the abuses of the law create norms that change our perceptions about reality. And satire speaks against this. In Dr. Calder's paper, he described how in this kind of Poetics of Disgust, he described how counter to the norms that disgust establishes norms by way of the body and by way of creating limits and boundaries, establishing limits and boundaries of the body, but that the poetics of disgust over determines that or surpasses that, and so becomes a kind of object in itself. At least that's one way I was thinking about how norms fit with in these two papers. And I was wondering in a couple of things about that. One was the question, going back to Kirsten's comments about essentialism, that on the one hand, it seems like norms, that satire exposes norms that actually aren't intrinsic, but are socially constructed. But on the other hand, satire, or disgust, rather, that's connected to satire, establishes something like essential norms of the body, or a body's relationship to the world. Okay, so I was interested in the question of essentialism, which seems already really precarious, in thinking about satire and these different modes of satire. And then this is a little bit not quite linked. I basically have these key terms that I'm interested in putting together. I was curious, just kind of throughout the day, about what is the object of satire? Does that matter? We've talked a lot about modes of satire, forms of satire. Does it matter what the satire is about? And I was thinking about this in terms of Professor Salvucci's paper, Dr. Salvucci's paper about trolls, and whether there's a distinction between Swift's satire and trolls like Trump in terms of the object of the satire. And going back to Suvir's comment about colonization, that colonial issues come up in Swift. Okay, so I wondered, in terms of thinking about the object, about bodies, which is another kind of key term that's come up throughout the day. And I was really interested in Paula McDowell's paper and the distinction between, or the connection between orality and corporeality. And I was thinking about corporeality and materiality, and what's the distinction between these two words? And so that also seems, thinking about the body seems like one way to loop back to thinking about these two different kinds of norms. So on the one hand, it's the body in Swift's like scatological poems, for example, that create disgust, that render disgust. And I was wondering if it matters, I wanted to bring gender into the discussion, to think about the difference between a female body versus a male body. And I was thinking about Stefan and Chloe, and how in that poem, Stefan acknowledges his human body, his corporality, and isn't particularly disgusted by it. He's worried about it, and he's worried about the discrepancy between his body and the body of Chloe, who he's idealizing at that point. It's only Chloe's body that becomes disgusting through her extracted waste. So I'm curious about. So I was curious about that. If that change, if that can kind of help us think about how disgust operates and satire operates, and also even Swift's anger about social norms would seem to be a kind of the social norm would seem to be an abstraction, but it occurs by way of bodily perceptions, or it changes bodily perceptions and judgment. And Swift satirizes by using metaphors of the body constantly in the Drapier's letters. He's constantly describing innards and the vital organs that are being used. The state of slavery is also the state of using and exploiting the inner, vital organs of the Irish people's bodies, as if bodies are land, literally, making this kind of allegorical link that also becomes a kind of weird literalization of some kind. There's this way in which the body becomes crucial to communicating the injustice of colonization, and also it's a monetary thing. There's this in the Drapier's letters, the slogan of the threat that they're going to eat the coins, they're going to be forced to eat coins, and the broke. Sorry. Down their throats, thank you. I was trying to remember what exactly that line was. Yeah, but that there's this weird link between the body and money. So I was curious about, I was curious about that link too. Okay, and then just my final thought or question is whether thinking about the body in satire helps us to think about Suvir's earlier question about whether the self is implicated, and thinking about Swift's self-disgust or acknowledgement of his own bodily aging processes in his birthday poems to Stella. So I was curious about whether the body would also possibly present a link back to the self, a kind of like or evidence that the self is implicated in this, that it can almost not help but be implicated because of the way the body, the author, the writer has a body, and that writing or self-expression is linked to the body in Swift's thinking, I think. So, okay.
Lovely. So should we just go down the list of speakers who can respond quickly to what they've heard? But when you respond, do play up your voices because there are people behind you. So if you can do a sort of 2/3 stance addressing that part of the audience, if you're saying, unless, oh, thank you, I forgot this. We have technology. We don't have to do 2/3 stance.
Let's shout at each other.
There we go. Thank you kindly. So where are we going to start? From the very first paper. Thank you.
Start with the beginning. What an incredible array of possibilities to pick up on here. I mean, that was just amazing. Coming back to the very first thought that I had listening to David, I was thinking about how I first got started in thinking about these issues and terms, because I think they help continue what was happening at the end of the first Q&A. My first book was on women and print, lower and middling class women's political activity through print. And as a result of working on distinct socioeconomic groups, I became more and more interested in popular oral culture and had this fantasy that in my second book I was going to go recover popular oral culture and contribute to that history. And of course, a couple years into doing that research, I realized that my terminology was incredibly anachronistic, that you literally cannot find the concept oral culture or the term oral culture. And Echo allowed me to prove that definitively. You type in oral culture, you get no hits. You type in oral tradition, you get thousands of hits. So at that point, I realized, the question became, where does the classification infrastructure, oral literate, written oral, print oral, where does that classification infrastructure come from? It is something that exists in history. And so I'm not trying to see how Swift is reifying or playing with our construct or classification infrastructure. I'm trying to understand how he saw things. And Alice actually had this wonderful question that we didn't have time for, but she brought up the way for Swift it may be a matter of ephemeral versus permanent, lasting, enduring versus evanescent, that the division isn't print, oral, written, oral, literate, illiterate. It's what lasts, what doesn't. So I just thought her comment was sort of more interesting than anything I could say.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Paul.
I'd just like to mention these are such impressive synthetic performances that apparently you came up with in the last couple hours. Wow. I wonder who put you up to that. To try to work between the two terms that David has established as keywords here, thinking about the mental labor of rhetorical wit and the physical work of travel, etymological cousins to travailler, to work. And I wonder if in drawing attention to projects, something that Swift is calling into question or organizations of labor. Who would write, a book about ears? Well, that implies an expenditure of time, resources, and energy. Why would somebody speak and perform the physical labor of transmitting or emitting sound waves across physical air molecules? And when you draw your discussion of the cucumber projector is something like a victim of industrialization, it occurs to me that his work is resource extraction, energy extraction, and he looks like a coal miner at the end of the scene. So I wonder if what's drawing attention, what might be drawing those terms together is not considering the third book as a satire of knowledge production, but one of labor and work toward the production of knowledge. But thanks again. There's a really just great responses.
So are we moving next to...
To me.
to Ruth, of course, sorry.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to sound very coherent compared to these incredible presentations. I'm feeling so tired that I had to write down a few notes. In response to what you said about the kind of totally bleak, negative outlook, Rosen said, actually, that having written his adaptation of Gulliver's Travels, he felt really quite depressed. He said it was a difficult experience for him. I think maybe one of the reasons for that is perhaps the reason that Swift's Gulliver's Travels isn't an entirely depressing experience. There are several reasons for that. I think one of them perhaps is the sheer joy of the language in it, that, the passage that was read with the cucumbers. Every single one of those words is so carefully chosen. Everything is so whittled and honed down so that, it says exactly what it wants to say with biting accuracy. That's terribly hard to put into a picture, I think. So what comes out in the picture is more negative than what comes out in the text because there isn't the joy of the language. Although, there is joy. I think he had a great time writing that language, that Cockney language. I think that must have been much more fun for him to compose than it was for me to try and decode. But therefore, that joy isn't quite the same. I think, however, that Jonathan Swift, I don't know if he traps the reader, but he certainly plays with the reader more than Rosen does. So there's, in response to what you were asking about whether we're trapped by the satire, perhaps we are slightly more victims of Swift's satire than we are of Rosen's satire, paradoxically. And when I was speaking earlier about Swift's kind of self-awareness, I was thinking of his remarks about how we're incapable of seeing ourselves in the mirror of satire. And I think if you are Swift and you set out to write, as he does in Gulliver's Travels, a satire on human pride, I don't think you can be totally unaware of the fact that you are yourself guilty of that very same sin, since it's a pretty proud project to establish in the first place, to demonstrate that everybody else is guilty of this pride. And I think Swift is aware of that. That's what I was referring to when I said I think he knows that in writing this text, he's kind of shooting himself a little bit in the foot as well. He's on the same level as everybody else. And in response to your remarks about utopianism, I think that for Swift, utopianism is just another example of that. The fact that human beings can, rather than look for practical solutions to the obvious problems on this earth, waste their energy by writing projects of perfect societies. That's just another element of what he sees as our kind of overweening pride that he is trying to prick with his satiric needle in his text, which obviously is something that doesn't fit in, I think, with Rosen's approach to things. We've probably moved to a post-utopian world, so that's not really one of his targets. Thank you.
Jim?
Thank you. Well, first off, again, I want to reiterate that tremendous job you did, and the opportunity ranged from hours to apparently minutes to get that together. So it was pretty impressive. First, Kate, I want to respond to you. You talked about the notion that Trump and Swift have different objects. Absolutely, and I don't mean to imply otherwise. I think what I'm saying is that trolls have so much in common with Swift that there's no reason they can't have similar objects too. So even if one hasn't emerged, why can't a troll be a new Swift? And and the idea that maybe the graphic novel, as Ruth suggested, is the medium of the age. maybe the medium of the future is the tweet. I don't know. I don't wish that on us. I'm just saying. Kirsten, you mentioned that the audience as partially the target or the victim of the satire, and Ruth just talked about that a little bit. And I was talking with Sharif a bit about this. That is certainly the case, but there's also a complicity in the audience, and that's the insider part. And you can really see this in Rosen's graphic novel with that Brobdingnagian language. Ruth became the victim of the effort to transliterate the language. She puts in all that labor and then only to discover that it is Cockney and it is vulgar, but at the same time, she's enacted the vulgarity of it, and therefore that makes her complicit. And I'm sure you continued to transliterate it, right? And that you became all the more complicit, right? And that is often how Swift's satire works. You mentioned the inherent nostalgia of satire. And this is something I've thought about a lot. Swift is nostalgic. Look at Gulliver's Travels and Lilliput. There's reference to the idealized society of the past that has devolved. The Brobdingnagians find evidence that their species was once much larger and they have degraded over time. This is all nostalgia and pessimism, right? Glubbdubdrib, need I say more? The Houyhnhnms, much has been made of the Platonic nature of their being, reaching back to Plato and the ancients. So there is that. At the same time, satire is, what's its point? Is it to scold, right? Or is there supposed to be some sort of direction in it, some sort of corrective, which is inherently optimistic? So there's a duality there, right? And I would argue, and forgive me for this, I would argue there is a similar duality in the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And that is in the word again, which is at once nostalgic, reaching back to the past, favoring the past, idealizing the past, and at the same time is looking to the future. So while it is inherently pessimistic, it is simultaneously optimistic. And this is part of the slipperiness of satire and I guess of modern politics as well. So.
Yes, and thanks a lot for your comments, and I'm amazed that you pulled them together in 20 minutes so thoroughly. One of the points that you raised was and it's actually building off of your comment about the aims of satire and what the aims were, and it reminded me of something Swift wrote, I think in one of his letters. Someone may remember, I think maybe to Pope, that his aim was to vex rather than instruct, and that strikes me as a kind of useful rewriting of Horace. If we think that vexing here, or to vex rather than entertain. Sorry, vex rather than entertain. Divert. Okay. Well, it's the vex, I guess, was the word that stuck with me, because that does seem kind of without purpose or direction, that it leaves you unsettled and upset, but without much to do with that changed feeling. So I think the vexing qualities of disgust are why he found disgust a useful emotion to deal with, because it is vexing and seems to build on itself rather than find any conclusion. I also liked what you asked about the body versus corporeality versus materiality, and I'm not sure I really have a response to that, but it's a striking distinction, and it made me aware of all the ways that the body, at least in Gulliver's Travels, is dehumanized and, in that sense, materialized. And maybe that's a way of, if it's not too simple to think about the corporeal and material along a a kind of living, non-living divide. That might be one way to address that question. Yeah, but thank you.
Barrett, can I ask you to stay for a minute with one word that you used that Katie picked up on that hasn't circulated as much as it used to, certainly when I was in graduate school or shortly after. Any conversation about Swift would take his misogyny, or what was perceived to be his misogyny, much more seriously as an analytic than it has surfaced here. But you used the word. So do you want her to address her concerns about the difference between male and female bodies and the way it plays a constitutive feature of Swift's satire? Not simply in those poems, but right across the board?
Well, I think definitely in those poems, I think it's central.
In Gulliver's Travels, I mean.
In Gulliver's Travels, yeah. It might get back to a conventional sort of association with between the female and the bodily. The women represent the body altogether, so maybe that's part of it. I think there is a fear of, for Gulliver, for Strephon to appear vulnerable or in that position, and then that gets sort of displaced onto the female bodies. I'm not sure I'm addressing your question, but that I see the poems as, I know there is a variety or school of thought about the poems that see them as a critique of male fantasies more than a critique of female bodies. I'm aware of that. And I think that the poems are doing several things at once, and they can certainly do those two things at the same time too. I think there's so much relentless description of Celia's bedroom that it can't just be cast aside when we learn that Strephon is viewing it the wrong way or in the wrong terms. So, yeah.
Sharif, now?
So I remember having lunch with Helen, I think like in 2008, and saying, I don't really get Swift. I've always, I always had a problem with trying to understand how Swiftian irony or satire differed from other authors, even though it's very clear that it differs. And I think in the background of my paper, I'm going to speak to norms, as you asked me to, and a little to misogyny. I think in the background of my paper are the two reasonable explanations of what Swift are doing, and they both agree with one another. James Boyd White and John Traugott, who say that typically irony just points to a kind of easily deducible third unstated term. So the thing that's being falsified usually can point you to the view that the author holds or wants to lead you to. But that Swift sort of takes on so many personas, it becomes unclear what that third position is. You're never able to properly deduce it. So it's a kind of chaos. I'm sure that Derridians love that. But to me, I guess what I'm doing is, I think he's more utopian than people give him credit for. That one of the things that he's doing with each of these sort of jurisdictions that he's going to is pointing to the ways in which they violate natural justice being the social contract. The problem is that if you believe in natural justice, if that's your vision of law, that means no judicial system is ever going to be adequate to natural justice. You're always theorizing ideally. So there's no content that you could give that would satisfy Swift. Every institution will seem ridiculous. He's caught in the opposite condition of Gulliver, right? Gulliver just simply tacitly accepts every institution that he encounters. And if what has him unmoored is this metric of judgment, this money, the standard that allows him to judge things, which for Swift would be natural justice or something, then that's what makes Gulliver so unable to digest difference, unable to normalize it. So women's bodies, sexual difference would be the prime difference that I think Swift would go to. It would be the first one. So here, I am sort of making his misogyny purposive. I think that there might be a kind of strategy to it, that Gulliver can't see boobs without seeing big, huge boobs that are overwhelming him, right? So there's something overwhelming about sexual difference to him that prevents him from producing a kind of standard or a norm. They don't fit the standard or norm that he is. Though he's also malleable, right? Because he lacks that metric, that standard of value. It means that every civilization sort of changes him, holds down his body, ties him down, makes him think that he is a horse. His self-perception of his body transforms. So I guess I haven't synthesized this yet, but those are my thoughts.
Do you guys want to respond to some of what you've heard? You'd be quite welcome.
Thank you, though. It's all really interesting and really helpful.
We have, yes, please, Helen.
I just wanted
What
to,
else?
I was John Traugott's student, so it makes me really happy to hear you talk about him. And he was a very mordant wit himself. But Sharif, there's this essay, you may well know it, but what you're saying reminds me that Traugott wrote this essay about Swift and utopia and talked a lot about More's Utopia and Swift's relation to that text. And he said that basically Swift's predicament was that he walked around this earth with utopia in his head, and he was tortured by that. So I think that's exactly what you are articulating there. So, and you articulated it really well. I am not going to dominate the discussion any further. I will talk to you all later because I have lots of things to say, but I see that John has something to say, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly amplify the point about utopia and the point about nostalgia in light of Kirsten's really helpful, profound comments about kind of the totalizing nature of Swift's critique and satire, which kind of nicely puts what I was trying to get at with asking about Rowson's kind of taking on the scope of Swift's satire, and just to kind of historicize, if we still do that, the point about nostalgia more, thinking about Ashley Marshall's book about Swift and history, that one of the things that it's hard to keep track of is that Swift's in a moment, and this is Marshall's argument, that things had recently gone bad and it was contingent, and there was the sense that 1688 or the Hanoverian moment or whatever it is, that there was an alternative back on the historical horizon, and we're now in a moment when everything now has turned to shit, but Swift could hold out the possibility that it hadn't, and or that it wasn't, that it was contingent, and that just seems to be worth bearing in mind.
So that would be the particular form of conservative anti-humanism, the historically appropriate form of conservative anti-humanism. At least I thought that's what you were saying. Any last comments? Please, right at the sorry, Michael, and then one more at the end, and then we'll call it.
I just have something to say about disgust.
Please.
No, actually,
Follow in it.
I've been thinking about, Scott. I've been thinking about disgust, but but in relation to a lot of the other comments, because one of the strange things about disgust is that it has this it follows a structure similar to what you've just described, which is when you're confronted by something and disgusted by it, it's very reassuring. At the same time, it's disturbing, because when one has an embodied response to something, there's a way in which you can trivialize that response because it's just the body, but you also can't deny that response because it is the body. And it plays both ways, right? So that if there's an embodied response, it may not be a transcendent value that your disgust is affirming, but it is at least something that's approaching a human, that's approaching some definition of human nature. The other thing I was thinking about, and it is a real question, had to do with what money does to what otherwise is a practice of distinction that's called bartering, right? So the whole point about bartering is that two things are exchangeable, but rarely in the same quantity, and often because say I might value one thing and Suvir might value another thing differently, right? So bartering is all about exchanging things based on differing value systems. And there's a way in which the distinction that was being made between sort of wit as opposed to other kinds of judgment, money gets rid of those differences and is very reductive in that way. And so one of the things I've been thinking about with Swift, because he brings these things to the foray, is on the one hand, there's the critique of how money works, which is about reducing everything to a sort of, you can make distinctions with money, but they're only quantitative. They're never qualitative, right? One thing might be $25 and another thing might be $10. So there's that kind of reductive thing that money does. And then there's what the body does, which seems to me a different kind of reductive act. And it seems to me that one of the things that we still are talking about and haven't worked out is what the relationship is between those two different, very different forms of utterly reductive materiality, the body and money, which is, and both are, as you put it very well, modes of representation. So that's where my brain is. I don't know if anyone wants to think about that further. It might just be the end of the day. Now that I've disgusted you, I'll drop the mic.
One last comment at the back, and then we are done.
Swift quotes in a letter Congreve's couplet, "Believe it, men have ever been the same, and all the golden age is but a dream." And he immediately says of that, "a vile moral." Well, of course, I wonder, is that ironic, a vile model? I mean, the official Swift would nostalgia and things being better and getting worse. Or, I'm at my wit's end when I think, I agree with Congreve as a matter of fact, but Swift, I don't know.
Paula?
Nobody's mentioned Christianity in this context.
I know, in this woefully secular age.
You have to believe that, we once had it all and we lost it. It's immoral to suggest that things can get better when God made it perfect and we wrecked it. So just wanted to throw that
Actually,
in.
you spoke about Christianity. Those dissenting preachers.
Yeah, right.
That is nothing but Christianity, only a Christianity of a kind that you might not particularly approve of, you being whoever is complaining about them.
We're fallen.
But that is the world. We're the ones who've fallen, not them. They knew exactly what they were up against. On that note, thank you very much, and thank you.